Good evening, sorors and guests. My name is Patricia Williamson. I am the New Jersey State Social Action Coordinator of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. I'd like to welcome you to today's listening session with the New Jersey Attorney General, Gurbir Grewal. Before we move forward, I'd like to introduce Maureen Taylor, who is the Central Jersey Alumni Chapter Technology Co-Chair, who is going to explain to us some housekeeping rules.
Okay. Good evening, folks. Again, this is Maureen Taylor. Just a few things for housekeeping. Everyone is in listen-only mode. And your webcams are off, so you'll only be seeing the panelists. You will use the Q&A to ask questions of the panelists. If you look at the bar at the end of your screen, you can see Q&A, and you can see to the right there the Q&A box that you'll see, and then you type in your questions. And the attendees will be able to see all the questions that are being asked, so you'll see the answers also. And just a reminder that this session is being recorded. Okay. I think that's it.
Okay, thank you so much, Dora Taylor.
Okay.
All right. Sorry about that. So what I'd like to do is provide a framing about what we are doing, or what we believe as members of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, and then we will move forward to give you an idea of the agenda. After this framing, we're going to have a personal experience that will be led by Niambi Harris. We will also have a brief poll. Probably the poll will go first, and then I will come back and say a few more things, and then we're going to go forward, okay? So Beverly Evans Smith, the national president of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. Just a minute, I wanted to mention that we are going to be recording this session. And so if we're not already recording, let's begin now. Okay. Beverly Evans Smith, the national president of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, issued a public statement on behalf of the sorority in May, condemning in June, condemning law enforcement's actions in the deaths of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd. She then issued a call to action for us as members of the sisterhood to use the power in our voices to demand changes to police reform and to garner seats at the table. There are several areas of reform we support as a sorority, some of which are already implemented in New Jersey. I'll name a few: requiring police to wear body cameras, implementation of de-escalation training for law enforcement, requiring psychological evaluation of police officers before hiring, review of our jurisdiction's use of force policy and the review of its alignment to best practices, mandating the creation of a citizen review board to review police misconduct complaints, and requiring unconscious bias training for all police officers. Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated has also we also have a resolution. We have a lot of resolutions, but there's one in particular that I'd like to lift up at this time that we share. It's called the Increasing Police Accountability Resolution that was submitted for presentation at the 2015 convention. But in part, essentially, what we're asking for on the federal level, and which we'll discuss on the state level, on the federal level, Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated reaffirms its commitment to ending police violence and abuse perpetrated against people of color by police and other law enforcement officers, and calls for the United States Department of Justice to aggressively prosecute police shootings of unarmed citizens as criminal violations of the civil rights of the victims. The sorority has issued national resolutions calling for ending police violence and increasing police accountability. Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated also supports the enactment of a federal law on the use of lethal force by law enforcement officials. The sorority supports mandatory crisis intervention training for law enforcement officers to include strategies for dealing with mentally ill suspects. The sorority also supports independent review boards at the local level to investigate the law enforcement agency or department in every case where a suspect is mortally wounded by an officer of that law enforcement agency or department. So Attorney General Grewal, we'd like to speak with you about some of these this evening. Just before we do, I'm going to ask those on a call to take a quick poll. I'll turn this over to Sora Taylor for a few minutes.
Okay, so folks, I'm going to launch a poll, and you can answer. Here it comes.
So the question is, for those of you that might be on the phone, you won't be able to participate, but at least you can hear it. Have you had a police incident before? Have you ever had a negative and or unwarranted interaction with law enforcement? Yes, I have. No, but a family member has. Or no, neither my family nor I have. So just take a few seconds to answer and press submit. And I know some people are still continuing to join us, but we'll take who we have. We have about just shy of 50 people here. And just as a reminder, and this is more so for the guests, we are a group of college-educated, primarily African-American women. So just to group this. Okay. Hopefully that's enough time. Okay, yes, I have, over half. No, but a family member has, 34%, and no, neither my family nor I have, 14%. Thank you so much for taking this poll with us. At this time, what we'd like to do, I'd like to introduce Nyambi Harris, Nyambi Daniels Harris. She's the Central Jersey Alumni Chapter Social Action Committee co-chair, who's going to describe an experience that she had an encounter with the police. And we'll talk about that afterwards. Sora Harris.
Good evening, Soros of the state of New Jersey, and also thank you, Attorney General, for listening to my story. So this was in March of 2006. I was on my way to work. It was around 7 a.m. to 7:30 a.m. driving on the Turnpike northbound. I was exiting off to, actually I was listening to Matasui, which was the Jewish reggae band at the time I was driving my car. And so I exited off on 13 and I saw the lights flash, the state trooper to pull me over. And this is one of the few times I was not speeding. So I was, more listening to the music. And I had stopped right before the toll booth, exit 13. That's a very busy area, the Gothel Bridge. And as I was about to pull my driver's license registration out, I looked out the window and saw in the rearview mirror the state trooper pointing a gun towards my head. So he was walking to my car, pointing a gun at my head. And so I was like, what's happening? Like, did I commit a crime that I didn't know about? Like, what just happened, right? And so because I was very nervous and he was yelling something, I figured out he told me to turn off the car, but I was too scared to turn off the car because I was scared if I pressed the button, then he'd think I'm making a move and he'll start shooting. And then I just finally said, well, if today's my day, it's my day. And I finally turned off the car, then it was roll down the window. And so as I rolled down the window, he reached in, he grabbed me through the door, out the car, and then slammed me on the back of my trunk. And then he proceeds to say, ma'am, this car has been reported stolen. In that very moment, I just flipped out. And I was like, of course, you know I was the one that reported stolen, so I was yelling all kind of things, so I'm going to keep it PG. And what happened was the officer, as I turned around, I realized there were 7 state troopers surrounding my car with guns over their doors, ready to, aim, shoot, and kill. And so, the officer's like, calm down, calm down. I was like, no, how do you expect me to calm down when there's like 7 guns shooting at my head? So finally another officer said, ma'am, I think I understand what's happening. Are you okay with me going to your glove compartment and pulling out your license and registration? And I was like, yes. And so they pulled it out. So they finally let me make a phone call. I made a phone call to my father, who was councilman of the township, who called the chief of police, who the chief of police then made a lot of phone calls so we can get this stuff straight. And so there was a lot of in between. So at the very end, I think this was the very lasting moment for me in this incident. So I guess the regional director or the chief of police of that squad unit for the state troopers, he came out, he was out there. And the officer was standing there and I was standing, right, outside on the turnpike. And he asked the officer, are you okay? And I was livid. So you're asking the officer that basically threatened my life, the law-abiding citizen who paid off her car, paid the insurance, going to work, not bothering anybody, that everything could have changed in a minute. Is he okay? And I think that that point in time, I became very concerned about the safety of myself, of my family, or any African-American, whether it be man, woman, or child, as they drive through New Jersey State Turnpike. And so that is my story, and one of many.
Dora Harris, I have to ask you to explain one portion that you left out. Remember, you said you reported it stolen. Tie that back in to how that's related to the incident.
Okay, so what happened is the car was actually stolen on my way to the airport a year before. The reason why I remember the date, it was actually the 1-year anniversary or birthday of my fiance had just died. And so they never took it out the system. When my car was found, they never took the car out the system. So the reason why I was frustrated was, 1, when I reclaimed the car, I didn't take out the system. But 2, what I asked him was, when the car was registered in my name. And so when I asked him, the car is registered in my name and my picture came up, why did you still stop me? And he said, oh, I could be a runner for a car. So that's why I had to call my father, because he had to call one of New Jersey cities to contact the whole state troopers to get this all released so they can understand that I was the owner of the car.
Okay. Thank you, Dora Harris. I know that's not an easy story to tell, but I appreciate it. Thank you very much. And what I want to say is, although Mrs. Harris's experience happened over a decade ago, this is not an old story. In fact, we learned this morning of Brittany Gilliam in Aurora, Colorado, who was stopped by police with guns drawn on her and 4 minors between the ages of 6 to 17 after mistaking her car for one that had been stolen. The police department has apologized and offered to pay for trauma counseling for the children and are being directed to look at new practices and training. But we're going to talk about this today with our esteemed guest, Attorney General Gurbir Grewal. We took him up on his offer during Delta Day at the State House Virtual Town Hall to be part of his listening session tour to speak more on topics under his purview, such as police reform. Attorney General Grewal assumed the office 2 years ago under the administration of Governor Murphy, and since assuming office, Attorney General Grewal has focused his attention on protecting the interests of New Jersey residents by expanding affirmative litigation, strengthening police community relations, reducing violent crime, and fighting the opioid epidemic. Before becoming New Jersey Attorney General, Grewal served as Bergen County prosecutor, the chief law enforcement officer of the most populous county in New Jersey, and home to nearly 1 million residents living in 70 municipalities. We do have members on here from Bergen County, as well as from 18 out of our 21 counties. And so we welcome you here today, and thank you for allowing us to be part of your listening tour. We have two moderators that are going to ask some questions, and we have, after that, the questions that we've already sent, we're going to have a few. So when people put them in question and answer, we'll see how many we can get to. Our moderators are Dr. Alicia Benjamin Sennett, who is the Morristown Alumni Chapter Social Action Committee co-chair, and Ms. Cassandra Keys, Monmouth County Alumni Chapter Social Action Committee co-chair. So I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Alicia Benjamin Sennett at this time.
As citizens, we recognize that many incidents of excessive use of force and police brutality occur because of a lack of understanding of different races and cultures. While there has been an increase in sensitivity, diversity training within law enforcement, its success seems questionable. Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated reaffirms its commitment to ending police violence and abuse perpetrated against people of color by police and other law enforcement officers. And we call for the U.S. Department of Justice to aggressively prosecute police shootings of unarmed citizens as criminal violations of the civil rights of the victims. The sorority has issued national resolutions calling for ending police violence and increasing police accountability. Attorney General Grewal, my question is, how do you propose tackling the issues related to excessive use of force and police brutality? And further, what is the status of continuing education to identify and create cultural diversity materials as required by New Jersey statute?
Well, thank you for that question. And thank you to Delta Sigma Theta Sorority and Patricia for the invitation to come back. Thank you to Nyambi for sharing her experience. It is by no means a unique experience, as we've heard, given the story out of Colorado, I believe you said. And it's unfortunately an experience where we have seen it happen time and time again in this state. And while I have experienced discrimination of my own, I've not had a gun drawn on me. And the experiences that I've had pale in comparison, but they do motivate me. And so some of the hard work that I want to share with you started well before recent events. It started when I first became Attorney General. Tackling issues related to excessive use of force and police brutality, it's not just a training issue. As you mentioned in your question, in your prefatory remarks, we've had trainings and we've seen how they've fallen short. This has to be really a comprehensive and a holistic approach. And I think the moment in which we find ourselves now, in the midst of the largest protest movement in our nation's history, in the midst of a nationwide call for change, I think we have a unique moment to have that comprehensive cultural shift that needs to happen. We need to change the culture in law enforcement. Some of that requires training. Some of that requires better hiring. And some of that requires better oversight as we look at law enforcement conduct. And so some of the things that we've done in this state is announce that we are going to have more robust tracking of use of force. We started that in December of 2019. What I mean by that is the Star Ledger, if you all remember the use of force report that they had put out, which was really a compilation of data that they got from 500 plus police departments across our state, which they digitized and then analyzed, and then showed trends on how force was being used at a higher rate against Black and brown communities in some parts of our state, and showed how certain officers were using force at a higher rate than their peers, and showed us where the problematic officers are, and showed us what we needed to be doing when it came to state law enforcement. We met that challenge in December of 2019. We said we were going to set up a statewide use of force reporting portal, which we are now launching to every municipality. And what this will allow us to do is see how force is being used in near real time. Officers are required to file a use of force report, but we are collecting data on demographics. We're collecting data on the circumstances under which force was used and what type of force was used. And we're monitoring that in near real time to make sure that we're identifying outliers and where they need to be held accountable, holding them accountable, and where they could be retrained, retraining them. But at the same time, in light of recent events, we realized that our state's use of force policy had to be changed. We realized that a policy that was 20 years old didn't reflect our values today and needed to be updated to reflect who we are as New Jerseyans today and all of the other tools that law enforcement has and should have in that continuum of force, the de-escalation all the way to the worst case scenario of deadly force, to make sure that we are using force in a responsible and proportional way if we have to in an unfortunate encounter where force is used. So we're undergoing that process right now. By the end of the year, we'll have a revised use of force policy that will be based on the sanctity of human life as its foundational principle. So that's part of the comprehensive change that we are undertaking here in New Jersey. But if officers don't meet the standards we set, we will hold them accountable. And so we are increasing our oversight capacity. I stood up a new office that I called the Office of Public Integrity and Accountability to restore confidence that law enforcement is doing their jobs responsibly. And if they are not, in the case of Ms. Harris's experience, that if you report something to an internal affairs function or to the state, that we have a dedicated body that's going to investigate those complaints and hold individuals responsible when they break the rules of the profession. So those are some of the things that we are doing in this state. It is not a single answer. It is changing culture through better professionalism and training, more transparency also in our use of force in the data piece that I talked about, and more accountability as well.
Let me ask you as a follow-up question to that, Attorney General. Will that database be accessible publicly?
That is a key part of what we are doing in this state. All of that material we are required to keep, and we require our officers to keep, our departments to keep. And then they are subject to public records requests. So you as a citizen can make an Oprah request under a Public Records Act for that data, but we don't want people to have to jump through hoops to see how their local departments are doing and how their local officers are doing. So once we have this database and this portal right, there will be a public-facing version of this. So you don't have to rely on a newspaper collecting all of this information and then making it searchable, that you will have it at your fingertips. Along those lines, I should also mention that we are undertaking steps to bring more transparency to police disciplinary records. There are many states, nearly 24, where there is much more transparency when it comes to those records than in our state. We are a leader in many areas, but in this area, we lag far behind. And so I have made it my goal to bring more transparency to police disciplinary records. So you could see how officers are not only using force, but if they fall short, if they're subject to major discipline, demoted, fired, that information is publicly available. Unfortunately, those efforts have been met by 5 different lawsuits in the matter of a week by 11 different police unions. So we are currently litigating that. But with that transparency, with those measures that I talked about, we could do the hard work of rebuilding trust or building trust really in communities where it might not have existed, and rebuilding it and repairing it in others where it's been damaged.
Wonderful, thank you. Just another question. Can you describe the crisis intervention team training that is used to reduce police use of force and death in custody incidents in response to situations involving individuals with mental health issues? And what is the current status of that pilot program, the CIT pilot program, in Atlantic City, Patterson, Trenton, and Millville, and with the New Jersey State Troopers in Trenton?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Unfortunately, we have seen in too many instances, there is someone who might be suffering from a psychiatric episode who interacts with law enforcement, and that law enforcement officer who he or she interacts with then uses deadly force. It may be lawful, but it's awful. And then that's the expression that's often used to describe those types of cases. Unfortunately, both as a county prosecutor and now as Attorney General, I have seen and investigated far too many of these cases where it is someone who is going through a psychiatric crisis, who then interacts with the law enforcement officer who uses deadly force. So what we wanted to do in our state, and what I did this as a county prosecutor first, was implement crisis intervention team training. Now, this is a model where you have law enforcement officers, about 20 of them, trained for 5 days with 20 mental health professionals, social workers, other stakeholders who are not in law enforcement, but are trained in different disciplines that might lend themselves to help de-escalate these types of situations. They spend 5 days together. It's a 40-hour training that I've gone through and that I have made available for law enforcement officers when I was a county prosecutor, and now I'm doing statewide. But what you do is you do really basic things. For example, I'm wearing earphones right now. One of the exercises in crisis intervention team training is to wear earphones plugged into an iPod, playing loud music, and then someone else is supposed to give you commands. And that's supposed to help an officer realize that this person is not ignoring my commands. They are just going through something else that is preventing them from processing what I'm saying to them. So we try to then teach officers different techniques. But more importantly, we try to develop connections with those mental health professionals that if they are called to that situation, when it is safe, they have relationships with that mental health professional to bring them or that resource to the scene to de-escalate the situation and get that person the psychiatric or mental health help that they need rather than have a violent interaction. We have seen it work. It is scientifically proven to work and it results in less violent and deadly police interactions. And it's another tool that we want to give our officers in the state. So the pilot is aimed at those cities that you mentioned and our troopers at the State House. It is underway. Some of our first classes are starting as we speak. And the hope there is not every officer needs it or can get it. You know, we have 36,000 cops in this state, and to do a 40-hour training like that is simply not possible. But we want a representative number on every police force that has this type of training. And if they're called out to a situation, or if there is a situation, perhaps they can be dispatched to that call. And again, then put that person in contact with the mental health help that they need to resolve situations more peacefully. It's worked in other states. The Chief Justice and I flew down to Miami and saw how they implement it and how they also employ it in their jails, how they employ it in that police department down there. And this is where we want to be as a state. We want to give our cops another tool in their toolkit to resolve situations peacefully.
Okay, thank you. Can you provide additional information on the Excellence in Policing initiative and statewide professional licensure for police officers?
So as I mentioned, some of the hard work that we are doing when it comes to improving policing in the state started well before the events, unfortunately, of May and subsequent to this May. We launched Excellence in Policing in December of 2019, and we really focused on three things, and I've touched on those themes. We focused on professionalism, accountability, and transparency. On the professionalism side, we wanted to revamp how we train our cops because we wanted to really emphasize de-escalation and other tools in the academy, and we wanted to make sure that we were training our cops in the best possible way. As part of that, from the accountability and professionalism side, we also challenged our Police Training Commission, which is the body that certifies our law enforcement officers when they graduate from the academy, to see if our state can implement a police licensing program. We're one of 5 states that presently doesn't license officers. We license attorneys, we license barbers, we license hairstylists, we license nurses, doctors. And when those individuals fall short, they can lose their license and they can't jump from department to department or from job to job without their license. We think our cops who are entrusted with one of the most sacred responsibilities and to keep our communities safe and to use force and deadly force when legally justified, well, they should be licensed too. And so our Police Training Commission was challenged in December to come back by this past June with their recommendation to see if it was feasible and what it would take in New Jersey. And so the Police Training Commission came back, said we should move towards licensing in New Jersey. I voted in favor of it at the meeting in June. It was unanimous. And so now we are putting together what that framework would look like. It will require legislation, and it would require some additional resources at the Police Training Commission, which is housed within the Attorney General's office to oversee it. But I'm confident that in the short term, we will, we will no longer be part of those 5 states that do not have licensing, but we'll have a best-in-class licensing system, again, for professionalism and accountability purposes.
Thank you, Attorney General Grewal. I appreciate your answers. I will now turn questions over to Sora Cassandra Keys.
Good evening, Attorney General Grewal. Thank you so much for joining us. As a licensed social worker in the state of New Jersey, I'm so glad to hear about the licensing implementation going forward. I'd like to ask, would you be in favor of stiffening penalties and holding police more accountable who witness but do not report inappropriate police behaviors?
I think we have very strong tools already. If we encounter that situation, we have the official misconduct statute in New Jersey, which imposes it both holds public officials accountable if they don't meet an affirmative duty, or if they take an affirmative action or don't take an action rather, and that could apply in situations where they don't do what they should be doing in a particular situation, and it's a mandatory minimum in some cases of 3 years, in other cases of 5 years. So we have that tool. I think what we ought to do, where we fall short, is not in the tools we have, but in changing culture. And what I mean by that is that we have to change this mindset of protecting the few to the detriment of the many. The fear that our cops have to come forward to report a fellow officer. I think that's where the challenge lies, because we could have all the strong laws we want. If an officer doesn't come forward to report a fellow officer when they see misconduct, or doesn't intervene when they should be intervening, and we have the evidence, certainly we'll hold them accountable, but we have to encourage them to come forward. And I think that starts in the academies. I think that starts in who we hire, and it starts in in the way we teach them once they get to the academies, and how we continue to train them. So that's what I would support, that we need to do better in those other areas, because we do have the tools.
Thank you so much. Do you agree that there should be a reduction of police presence in our communities?
This is a challenging question. We hear a lot of talk about defunding the police. And, I think the challenge there is, if you ask the 52 attendees on this call what that means, we might get 52 different answers. What I think the solution is leaving it to the communities that are affected, because it's not a one-size-fits-all strategy. I think if you allow community members robust engagement with their local departments, with their local governments, and let them decide and have a say in how policing happens in their communities, I think that's where the answer lies. And I think you will find in some places there might be a call for additional law enforcement. For example, in Camden, which is often cited as an example of how law enforcement has been reimagined, there was an increase after that initial police department was disbanded and then reconstituted. The community wanted more officers. It's a question of what those officers then do. And that's where the chief comes in. What Scott Thompson did in Camden, when that police department was reimagined and he had more officers, is he said that I don't want my officers treating my residents as a source of income. I want them to be mindful of how a $250 ticket can disrupt somebody's life when they're making $15,000 a year. And so why don't we have more positive interactions? I will make the metric of your successful performance of your job the number of community interactions you have, not the number of tickets you issue. And then get out of your cars, get onto the streets, talk and meet people. In Newark, Mayor Baraka and Director Ambrose are hiring more law enforcement officers, but they're requiring that they start their careers doing community policing, walking the beat, meeting people, recording those contacts. So I think it's a community by community decision. Then it's a decision of what our officers are doing once they're in the communities.
Thank you. What methods can you employ locally As members of Delta, what methods can we employ locally as members of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated to advance changes in policing?
I think the engagement that we're having right now is certainly part of it. I think the engagement that Patricia was mentioning, that the challenge that you received from your national president to become more involved and more engaged at a local level, the day at the State House, which we did virtually, where you're hearing from your elected officials and your appointed officials and interacting with them and sharing your views on whether it's education with Lamont when he was on the call, or law enforcement issues with me. I think engagement is critical, because I think what we have to remember is that we both govern by the consent of the people, and in my case, we police by the consent of the people. And in order for us to do that effectively, I have to take all the steps that I can to engage with communities across this state, to learn what community concerns are, to learn what the issues are, to learn where we should be doing more. And organizations like this can create that space also for that conversation. I'll give you a perfect example to bring it back where we started with Niambi earlier on. I have always considered myself to be progressive and thoughtful on law enforcement issues. I have always thought myself to be engaged on a whole number of issues and understanding, you know, the complexities of discrimination and race and justice issues. But guess what? I will never have the experience of what it means to be a Black man in America. I will not have lived that experience. And that really came home to me in a really powerful way recently when I was holding one of these town halls with my colleague, another attorney general in Illinois, Kwame Raoul. And so we were talking about our experiences. And sure, I've been stopped, I've been profiled, I've been put through secondary security at every airport I've gone through until I became attorney general. I've had those negative experiences. But when he started talking about his experiences, I've never had a gun pulled on me by a law enforcement officer. He talked about the first time that happened with him at age 17. He talked about the second time that happened with him at age 19. He talked about how after he became state senator, how his son was stopped because there had been a shooting in the area and his son was walking home from school, and how his son went from the son of a state senator to a suspect just because of the color of his skin. Those are experiences that I will never have. But what I can do is listen. And that's why this type of engagement and hearing Niambi's experience and hearing other experiences helps me better understand and better do my job. And so I think that's what I would encourage the members of this sorority to do, is to engage with your local police chiefs, engage and demand more of people like me, and create spaces for conversation like this one.
So informative and enlightening. You have indicated that the state should be spending more, not less money, to improve policing in the state. Can you please expand on this idea?
You know, this is the problem I have with the defunding debate, and I fully understand it, and I understand some of the complexities attendant to it. That we don't need the police to be doing all these other things, right? We don't need the police to be the mental health counselors. We don't need the police to be the drug counselors or the marriage counselors. We need to be investing in other systems. And I totally agree that we need to be doing that. You know, we need to fix our education system. We need to fix our healthcare system. We need to make sure that we have environmental justice, that we're addressing environmental issues in all communities. We need to fix the mental health system and the healthcare system, because we've seen in the current pandemic how it disproportionately disadvantages Black and brown communities. That COVID-19 has brought that in stark light right now, that is an issue front and center. But those systems are not going to be fixed overnight. And in the meantime, we're not going to reimagine policing overnight. So I think what we need to be doing is more smartly funding law enforcement, not defunding. We need to make sure that we're prioritizing the CIT training that I talked about, the crisis intervention team training. We need to be prioritizing diversion programs for young people. We need to be prioritizing diversion programs for those who are suffering from drug addiction. We need to be doing more cultural sensitivity training and implicit bias training, which Patricia talked about at the top of the call. We've done that. I mandated that for the state police in 2018, and we trained every state trooper on implicit bias in person. And we need to do that all across our state. And to do that, our departments need more for their training budgets, which are tiny to begin with. The majority of their budgets are payroll. It's not really anything more than that. I think 90% of most budgets are the payroll for the officers. So I think we need to be better funding, more smartly funding, certainly at the same time reimagining the role of what law enforcement is and building up all those other systems that are broken and where cops are left to be that last sort of safety net. And they're doing in a lot of parts of the state a magnificent job in meeting those roles. Crisis intervention team training, a lot of our departments are doing that on their own. Before I said that we were going to start mandating it. Implicit bias training, a lot of folks are doing it on their own. The diversion programs for low-level offenders, a lot are doing it on their own. The police athletic leagues using funds to do more community-oriented programs. They've been doing it, and I think they should continue doing that. And so we should be smartly funding at this point.
Well, I thank you so much for your responses to our questions thus far. And I'd this time like to turn it over to Sergeant Patricia Williamson for our final closing.
Okay, thank you so much, Sor Key, Sor Benjamin Sennett. And Attorney General Grewal, thank you so much for answering these questions on police reform. I would like to say, those of you that have questions, there are some that were sent to us after questions were sent to the AG's office. Feel free to put them in the Q&A section at this time. I have two other questions for you, Attorney General, that are not directly related with police reform. So we'll call them hot topics. They're all hot topics, but this is just kind of a category that we're going to put these in. And the first one is very near and dear to me. In addition to what I do here with Delta Sigma Theta Sorority, I am the New Jersey Counts Project Director at the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. And so I have been working on creating a statewide strategic plan to reach as many people, particularly African Americans, but people of color, to get counted in the 2020 census. And with the pandemic, no one expected that. But with everything else that has been going on, we have had quite the last 4 weeks. And so would you please tell us more about the state lawsuit filed against the Trump administration over the presidential memorandum to exclude undocumented residents from the reapportionment count?
Sure. Last month we joined a lawsuit to challenge that memorandum, which the president issued, which for the first time in our state's history would exclude undocumented immigrants from being counted from the census for state population totals, which, as you know, are used for the apportionment of our congressional seats, which are used for other sort of budget-related decisions. And the Constitution, what the Constitution calls for is an actual enumeration, and it doesn't distinguish between documented, undocumented, citizens, non-citizens. And I think, we have a long history in New Jersey of preserving inclusion of undocumented residents who are part of our communities. Our representatives don't just represent citizens, they represent all the people in their communities. And they're called upon to deliver services to all the people in their communities. And undocumented our brothers and sisters, neighbors, friends, have a pathway, some cases, to citizenship and end up becoming citizens and part of our democracy. So they live in our communities. They must be counted in determining our state's representation in Congress. And so we challenged the administration on it. The suit is making its way through the courts. We previously beat back efforts by the government when they wanted to have the immigration question, the citizenship question on the census, and we thought that would intimidate and lead to an undercount. And so this is yet another attempt at the 11th hour to intimidate immigrant communities and marginalized communities and undermine our representation in Congress. So we're successful. It's a coalition. We're hopeful that we'll be successful. It's a coalition of other attorneys general, and we will continue this fight, and it's an important fight for our state.
Thank you so much. We appreciate the support. Another question, this is a separate question. How can you make your office more accountable to families negatively impacted by ICE and mass incarceration policies?
Yeah, I guess two different questions on mass incarceration and ICE. On ICE, we issued something that we call the Immigrant Trust Directive in November of 2018, and it became effective in March of 2019. And what we did there was we drew a bright, clear line between our state's law enforcement officers on the one hand and federal immigration officers who enforce the civil immigration laws of our country on the other hand. And the reason we did it is because we saw and we heard from listening sessions and through other stakeholders that there was a tremendous amount of confusion because undocumented populations, vulnerable populations, marginalized communities didn't differentiate between the federal civil immigration officer or the state law enforcement officer. So they did not go and report their abuser in a domestic violence situation, fearing that it would land them in a deportation facility if they didn't have status. They didn't come forward to testify against an abuser at trial. So in order to create that bright line, to create trust, we issued that directive. We went out there, we messaged that you can come to us as state law enforcement, and we will not share your information with federal civil immigration authorities. We won't help them in doing their enforcement actions because we think that trust is so critical to public safety. We were challenged by a lot of sheriffs. We were challenged by some politicians in different parts of the state. And just last week, a judge dismissed those lawsuits against us in a 53-page opinion, which really knocked down every single argument that they made, saying that we couldn't do this to build trust between our immigrant communities and law enforcement. On mass incarceration policies, I wrote an op-ed last year on the need for us to have meaningful sentencing reform, and that we needed to end mandatory minimums for whole categories of crimes, in particular nonviolent drug offenses, nonviolent property offenses, that we needed to have more meaningful reentry programs, that we needed to address the racial disparities in our prison systems. And we had a lot of engagement around that, and the governor reconstituted the Criminal Sentencing Disposition Commission, which had sat idle throughout the past administration to look at these issues. And so we actually did meaningful work in that commission, which I was a part of, chaired by Chief Justice Poritz, former Chief Justice, former Attorney General, and we came up with a set of recommendations. And those recommendations were then introduced in the form of legislation and are making their way to the governor's desk. And I think that will go a long way to address issues related to mass incarceration. That's a back end fix. We also have to invest in the front end, and we have to invest in making sure we have better violence interruption programs, better methods for preventing young people from getting into the criminal justice system, more diversion. And then also more meaningful diversion programs for individuals who touch the criminal justice system on the front end. And those are the things we're working on as well.
Okay, thank you. I received a few other questions. So I'm noticing that about half of the people that registered actually joined, and I'm receiving messages about power outages. So I'm glad that this is being recorded, because we do have some questions that we can ask you now, and we can get the answers to them at a later date. One of the questions, you answered the majority of the questions in terms of your action plan to address police reform. second part of it, we know that New York Governor Cuomo has asked for an action plan by second quarter next year. What is New Jersey's timeline, if there is one?
So I think, we are really leading on a number of these issues already, when it comes to use of force, when it comes to licensing, when it comes to revamping training, when it comes to improving how we hire, addressing issues of diversity and inclusion in law enforcement. So I think those are all things that are well underway in New Jersey. When we talked about excellence in policing in 2019, that was the basis for that, those programs that I talked about. Transparency is one area where we lag behind. And so I think that the time frame on that is hard to predict because it's now in the court system, the transparency of police records. What New York did was they did it legislatively. They repealed their 50A law, which prevented the public disclosure of police disciplinary files. But even there, they're being challenged in court. And so it's hard to tell you what the timetable will be on these things. But certainly use of force, the portals will be done in fairly short order. The policy will be revamped by the end of this year. Licensing may take a little bit longer, but we're hopeful that we'll get it done by next year. Revamping the police training manual, that's something that we are hopeful that we'll get done next year as well. And then, the whole changing culture will take time, but we're not going to lose this moment and the momentum that we have in this particular moment.
Okay. You mentioned, yes, to say that it's in the courts is an understatement. You said there were 5 lawsuits created in a week. Is there some not happy, but maybe some sort of meeting of the minds where what is it that is being challenged? And is there something that you can address with that so that something moves forward? Because that is quite a lot of litigation.
It was 5 separate lawsuits by 11 different police unions against me in 1 week. And so I will just, let me just show you what we did. We were here at zero transparency when it came to internal affairs files. What I had required last year was for the first time that we would have summary reports by the end of the year and end of each year without the officers' names about each police department would have to put on its website that an officer received major discipline for doing X, Y, and Z. And it would be in summary fashion, anonymous. I felt that in light of recent events, that I needed to change my position when it came to transparency of police records. I think in order to have the legitimacy and trust to do our jobs, we need to have transparency. And so what I said is, for those reports that I required, those anonymous reports about police discipline, major discipline, which is suspensions of 5 days or more, demotions, or when someone is fired, well, now I'm going to require you to put the name on that too, the officer's name, because Patricia Williamson should know in her town if Officer Smith got 6-day suspension, because without the name, it's just really meaningless. And I said, in the case of the state police, we had to do these anonymized reports pursuant to the consent decree, which we were under for years, and we have them going back 20 years. So retrospectively, I'm going to make public the names of all those officers who received discipline for 20 years. These are just summaries, paragraphs. This is not the file. In New York, they went all the way here to complete transparency. So when you talk about a medium, I went not even a quarter of the way to where New York went, thinking that this was a intermediate step where we're balancing all the privacy concerns and other concerns that were being raised, but being more transparent than we were. So it was disappointing that my balanced and I think measured step was met with that type of opposition. And I was met with opposition by civil rights groups that wanted to go even further. So, but at least those civil rights groups supported my litigation. They joined my litigation and filed supportive briefs, understanding that this was a huge sea change for New Jersey.
Okay, I'm unmuted again. Thank you. We have one more question and about 2 or 3 more minutes. We wanted to have you speak to us about the drop boxes for voting ballots and the security of those boxes if we have them. And I guess that really more so on that security piece, because we know based on what we're hearing, if we're doing vote by mail again for the presidential election, the post office, with the backlog and everything, these drop boxes may become very important.
Yeah,
Can
so
you,
I could touch on it. This usually, this is a little bit outside my lane because this comes under the Secretary of State, who's got the oversight over the elections. And certainly we have drop boxes and we're taking steps to make sure that they're in a location where they can be monitored. Where I get into it is people are abusing the process, and we learn of information of ballot stuffing or thefts of mail-in ballots, or people being paid for their absentee ballots or their mail-ins. And unfortunately, we've had to bring criminal cases because people were taking advantage of the mail-in system in certain local elections recently. So the Secretary of State is really the leader on this. So I would, sort of defer to her as to the steps she's taking for the national election.
yeah, we'll have to take most of that to Secretary of State Tahisha Wade. Do you get a lot of those issues?
Well, we arrested 4 in the recent local election in Patterson. So it is something.
I heard a lot about.
Yeah, and so without talking about specific cases, that's one I could talk about because people have been charged. We're being vigilant, and people are should report to us. And the other thing I will say, also when I talk about reporting, when we talk about police accountability, we need everyone to be eyes and ears, and we need, body cams certainly are one check, but have confidence in reporting any sort of misconduct that you see or experience or witness, because you might not think it's significant, but it may fit with a larger pattern. And if you don't feel comfortable going to your local police department because you don't trust them, or there might be an issue there, go to your county prosecutor. If you don't feel comfortable going to your county prosecutor, go to the Attorney General's office and report it to us.
Okay. Well, thank you. I truly, truly appreciate all of the answers to the questions. I know we had you on the hot seat for a little while, but we really appreciate your transparency and all that you're doing in the state of New Jersey. We will be continuing many of our conversations with our county prosecutors, as you mentioned, since all of our chapters have specific service areas per county. We've already been in contact with some of the county prosecutors, such as Prosecutor Jennifer Webb McRae, that you were with us at Delta Day at the State House. So we will have those conversations as well. We definitely hope periodically that we will get a chance to touch base with you again in terms of some of the things that are going on, and just check in to see how things are doing. And if there's something you need for us to do as advocates, please let us know, because we are a formidable team. So there's 1,500 of us actively in the state of New Jersey, and we may be small on this call today, but trust me, we're all together as one. And so we just want to thank you again for coming. And I'd also just like to thank all of the people that have been behind the scenes and in front of the scenes that were helpful in putting this together again. I think that is it. We have about 30 seconds. Well, did you have any closing remarks? I should have asked you that, but I gave mine. But if you had any, we can go over a minute or two.
No, I thank you for the invitation. I look forward to continuing the conversation, hopefully in person in the near future. And thank you for being engaged. And thank you for creating the space for this conversation. And continue to ask more people like me and engage with your county prosecutors, because the solutions to these problems have to be collaborative.
Yes, absolutely. So we will work on these things together. Thank you so much, Attorney General Grewal, sorors, and guests. Thank you so much. This concludes our listening session. Have a wonderful evening.